Tom, there is a growing call from world leaders, including the Prime Minister, for a humanitarian pause in order to deliver desperately needed aid into Gaza. Let's start there. Our Prime Minister says he is in support of a humanitarian pause, along with other world leaders. What do you make of the wording? What is the difference between a pause and a ceasefire, and why does it matter?
Well, it matters because a call by Canada for a ceasefire would essentially mean that Israel would not have the right to defend itself. Israel was hit by well over 5,000 rockets that were intentionally targeted at civilians. We know that hundreds of people were taken hostage, of course, another breach of international law and a war crime. And we saw well over 1,000 Israelis murdered in cold blood in the most horrific way by the terrorist group Hamas. So you can't be calling for a generalized ceasefire when Israel is in this type of life and death situation and has been for some time. Now, everybody is going to correctly point out the fact that with this approach, everything that we've seen for the past decades means that this is going to lead to more recrimination, more hatred, more bloodshed. But Israel has vowed to get rid of the terrorist group Hamas. This idea of a humanitarian pause is to say, let's just make sure that those big trucks, the 18-wheelers that are massed at the border crossing between Rafah and Gaza and the Egyptian side are still able to get through to bring in things that are important, food, water in particular, to make sure that the people who have been told to go to the south have something to fall back on, that they can live. So the United Nations is trying to move in, lots of humanitarian groups from around the world. So that's legitimate, but it's not clear that there have been a lot of attacks on those convoys coming in. So the humanitarian pause would mean a pause where? Everywhere? And if that's the case, how long? So it's a very tricky thing, as you correctly point out, with regard to the terminology, because Israel has made it quite clear that they're going in.
The feds are calling for the pause on airstrikes, but also saying Israel has the right to defend itself. Is this mixed messaging, Tom?
Yep. And it's also mixed messaging when in the morning on Tuesday, we had Bill Blair saying we've got to eliminate Hamas, and how can you make a deal with a terrorist group that won't respect it? And in the afternoon, you have Mr. Trudeau calling for the pause that you just explained. So yes, it's obvious mixed messaging, and it's so disturbing when we're playing a role on the world stage. And we're a member of the G7. We're a good middle power. We can speak to the Americans, we can speak to the Israelis. We've got a good, long-standing relationship with them, but we can't even get our own house in order. You can just pile that on top of the mess, the imbroglio with China, the utter mess, the chaos that's been created in our relationship with the most populous country in the world, India, based on allegations that have yet to have been backed up by any sort of facts. We're in trouble. And I don't blame, frankly, Mélanie Joly. I think that she's been doing a good job. But I think that Mr. Trudeau himself has tended to move in with wording that will sometimes comfort him on a very specific Canadian issue, like talking about India on the day that the Parliament came back to as a massive distraction. But here it's also, he's under pressure. He's got 23 members of his caucus who have signed a petition calling for a ceasefire outright. So he's trying to navigate those choppy waters, trying to find a way between the paint and the wall. But at some point, you've got to be clear. And the Canadian government has been, unfortunately, anything but clear for the past few days.
What do you think is going on behind the scenes in terms of Canada's role in trying to free any potential hostages being held by Hamas?
Well, in what we just saw together, you're talking, Marcia, about hundreds of families who have been affected by those hostage takings, and they want the Israeli government to make that top of mind. The Americans have a lot of hostages there as well. Canada has refused to identify or to say the number because they think that that's the right move in terms of security. It might indeed be the right move. But overall, that is an issue that's extraordinarily important. Against the overall numbers of people who've been killed thus far, it's relatively small, but it's such a strong emotional issue, and the circumstances often horrific. Then Hamas put videos of their rendering up online, so people know the conditions. A few people have been let go. They're talking about what they went through, and I'm sure they're being debriefed by the Israeli military right now. But it's not an easy situation all around. It's one that's not born yesterday. This has been going on for decades. I do see a glimmer of hope that as the world concentrates on what's happening here, some of the key actors that will include, of course, Jordan and Egypt, the United States. One would hope Canada would have a positive role possibly to play, or a historic role as peacekeepers would be a good example. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is going to have a lot to say about this as well, because it's making overtures to have better relationships with Iran. And Iran has made it clear over the years that its goal is the elimination of the state of Israel and presumably the 8.5 million Jews who live there. And Hamas has made it clear they want to kill Jews, and that's what they carried out in the most horrific way. So Israel has faced existential threats in its existence. It was created 75 years ago, and it's gone through some really, really tough times. This is probably the toughest, and how they play it out, I think, has to reflect the wise wording of the very experienced Joe Biden, which was, when the United States lashed out after 9/11, there were unpredicted consequences long term. And I think that Israel is starting to take that to heart, because their more methodological approach to this whole thing, going at it slowly, determined, clearly, but not doing something that would be likely to produce a very strong reaction against them by the rest of the world.
Yeah.
That's wise.
Yeah, I think Israel concerned as well about their global image. Tom, thank you so much for that. Good to see you this Thursday morning. Tom Mulcair is CTV's political commentator, and he's the former leader of the NDP.